Hello, all you subjects of the internet out there. I am the Aromantic Shipper, back again with yet another video. So I'm about to drop a bit of a controversial opinion. I like The Big Bang Theory. I know, complete and utter sacrilege. How could I possibly like something so painfully average and cringeworthy and universally despised as The Big Bang Theory? Well, I guess part of it might have to do with nostalgia. I look back at The Big Bang Theory with fond memories because, well, The Big Bang Theory is actually the first adult live-action sitcom that I ever watched. And one of the last, too. At least for now, I've never watched, The Office, I've never watched How I Met Your Mother, I've never watched Seinfeld. I've watched tons of kids' sitcoms over the years, but ironically, as I grew older, I got more into animation, and my live-action content was relegated to more story-based stuff like The Walking Dead and Breaking Bad. But not The Big Bang Theory, though. No, sir. I have watched every single episode of every single season in the show, many multiple times, and I gotta say, I just do not get why so many people have a burning hatred of this show. I mean, maybe it is just my nostalgia goggles, but I think that The Big Bang Theory is a very adequate show. Is it anything great?
Ha! No.
But there is a reason why it went on for as long as it did and became as popular as it did. The main cast of characters is honestly pretty good for the most part, and they all go through significant and satisfying character development throughout the seasons. Well, except for Raj, sorry. The actors are also really great at portraying them. They all have great banter with one another. I guess I'll just kind of defend against some of the common complaints levied against this show for a bit. Firstly, I know one of the things a lot of people say is that the characters act horribly towards one another, doing nothing but making fun of each other and putting other people down, which isn't fun to watch. To which I would respond, yes, the characters do make fun of each other a lot, and it is fun to watch. Conflict is the basis of comedy, and it's fun watching the characters get into petty, ridiculous arguments with one another, especially the moments where it gets cartoonishly over the top. Like when Sheldon tried to make Leonard's head explode with his mind when they were at that physics conference. But the thing is, even though, yes, the characters do sometimes act like dicks to one another, I never really got the sense that the characters hated each other, and there's a sense of genuine care and compassion towards one another that is shown as the show goes on. A bunch of people criticize the show for not being funny and having really cringe-worthy comedy, saying that it only relies on nothing more than empty and vacuous references to nerd speak. And I honestly don't know what those people are talking about. First of all, there is comedy that doesn't rely on referential humor. Remember that episode where all the characters got high in the desert? And secondly, yeah, the show does reference a lot of geek culture and scientific concepts, and even though that might not be the most elegant or sophisticated style of comedy, I like it, and I think a lot of people miss that the joke isn't usually, hey, look, we made a reference to something. It's clearly established that the characters in the show are able to understand things in normal everyday life better by relating them to things that they have an interest in, something I find pretty relatable, and the comedy branches from the disconnect between the situation and how the characters think and talk about it. It's like, in one episode, Sheldon creates an algorithm for how to make friends. Or, think back to the finale of Season 1. Sheldon tries to talk to Penny about how she feels about going out with Leonard using a long-winded metaphor involving Schrodinger's cat, and she struggles to understand it. And then later, when Leonard is nervous about going out with Penny, Sheldon just says Schrodinger's cat to him, and he instantly gets it. That's where the comedy comes from. Comedy is subjective, but I really just do not agree with people when they try to claim that the jokes in The Big Bang Theory aren't funny. I mean, yeah, not all of the jokes hit, of course, and particularly in the later seasons, I think a lot of the comedy ended up getting really stale. But throughout the first 5 seasons or so, I can unequivocally say that this show was really funny, and had tons of moments that make me laugh out loud and had really good timing.
Geology isn't a real science!
If only it wasn't for that laugh track, though. For real, that's the criticism that I 100% agree with. It's really cringeworthy. I don't know why sitcoms even use those. They're so pointless, and I'm really glad that more sitcoms without the use of a laugh track have been coming out recently. Another criticism I often see lobbed at The Big Bang Theory is that the show is sexist and the male characters act really misogynistically towards women, who are portrayed with their feelings and desires being less important than those of men. I mean, I won't deny that a lot of the male characters in The Big Bang Theory act very misogynistically, especially Howard in the earlier seasons, but I can't really think of many instances in the show where those moments are treated as anything other than callous and creepy. The show does not portray misogynistic behavior as a good thing, at least from what I can tell, though I do admit that the show choosing to often portray sexist and misogynistic behavior as something to be laughed at and made fun of, rather than directly condemned, could come off as somewhat problematic to some. As for women's desires and motivations being portrayed as not important as men's, I don't really think that checks out. I mean, Penny, Bernadette, and Amy all have their own wants and goals. They aren't tied to the goals and desires of their husbands, or at least Amy isn't anymore, as she might have been initially. One common example I see a lot of people bring up when talking about how The Big Bang Theory is sexist is the episode where Penny finally gets sick of Howard's misogynistic comments and calls him out for his behavior, rather than ignoring him. After this, Howard sinks into somewhat of a depression, and Penny tries to go and apologize to him to get him back to normal. People's argument is that Penny was fully in the right for calling him out, and yet she is treated like the bad guy for making a male character feel bad. I would agree that Penny was fully in the right, and here's the thing, I think the show does too. People kind of seem to forget how this episode ends. When Penny goes over to try to comfort Howard, he tries to take advantage of the situation and kiss her, and then she breaks his nose and doesn't offer him any more sympathy. I can confidently say that the episode was not on Team Howard. I think my biggest complaint when it comes to the show's female representation is its weird insistence that stuff like comic books and anime and other geeky stuff is nearly exclusively a male interest. I mean, there are other women of science portrayed in the show, but I really don't like how it leads into the stereotype that geeky subculture is only populated by men, with people at the comic book store being amazed, apparently, seeing a woman walk in. I mean, yeah, sure, there are a few female geek characters that get introduced, and the female leads even get more into geek culture as the time goes on in the show, but that's still an aspect that's lacking a lot for the show. I mean, would it not have made sense to have, like, for example, Amy be obsessed with geek culture too, to give her more in common with Sheldon, especially since she was discovered by Howard and Raj on a dating site and was supposed to be his perfect match? Other than that, though, I don't really think that a strong case can be made for The Big Bang Theory endorsing sexist attitudes. Now that we've got to talking about some of the criticisms levied at this show, let's get to talk about some of the things that I really like about The Big Bang Theory. One of my favorite aspects of The Big Bang Theory, and what drew me to it in the first place, contrasted with other sitcoms, was the fact that it focused a lot on nerd stuff, because, well, I am a massive nerd, and always have been, and it was really cool that such a popular show had science geeks as their main characters. I mean, it is kind of true that the show would go on to focus more on the relationships rather than the nerdier aspects, which was a bit disappointing, but they never really left the show, and in the later seasons, the show often went out of its way to show how important the characters' scientific work was to them. And I think it's really cool that the series ended with Sheldon finally achieving his dream of winning the Nobel Prize. As a nerd myself, I have to say that I don't entirely agree with the criticism that many people have that this show is basically just an insult to nerd culture, rather than a celebration of it. I've heard some people calling The Big Bang Theory nerd blackface, and come on, really? I mean, of course there is mockery of aspects of nerd culture, but I mean, it's a comedy show. Of course they're going to poke fun at stuff. But I don't think that's necessarily insulting nerd culture if you don't take it too personally. I mean, I hold to the belief that almost nothing is above mockery and parody, but I can say from personal experience that when the characters are geeking out and going on long tangents about stuff like Star Wars, it felt all too real to me. Plus, it's not as if the show just portrays the characters' interest in science and fiction to be entirely a bad thing. I mean, it showcases how passionate the characters get about their interests and how much joy and happiness they get from interacting with people with like-minded interests of their own. Of course, the show also shows how getting too obsessed with a particular interest at the cost of one's relationships can become a real problem, a message that I struggle with taking to heart in my own life. But the characters don't end the series by growing out of their nerd phase. They are still massive nerds who like comic books and science and anime. The show clearly paints intelligence as a great virtue and something to be valued, and these characters aren't just losers and the butt of jokes. They are highly accomplished and brilliant scientists and end up in committed and stable relationships by the end. Well, except for Raj, sorry. And they actually have their really cool moments in addition to their silly ones. Like, as an example, there is an episode where Leonard meets his high school bully again, and he turns out to be a drunk idiot loser who grew up to be way less successful than Leonard. And he's also somehow Sheldon's father. What? And in another episode, Leonard gives a great speech to a graduating high school class for the kids who feel like they are looked down upon or underappreciated for their intelligence, and how things will get better in the future, and basically tells the popular kids that their lives aren't going to be so easy in the real world. In one episode in Season 1, there's actually a direct example of the show outright stating that you don't need to grow out of your interest to become an adult, as it starts out with Penny freaking out at Leonard about how he wastes his time on meaningless obsessions, but later apologizes to him, saying that the things he loves are what makes him him. I just found a lot of moments in the show endearingly relatable, and I think my enjoyment of it was heightened and not diminished due to the fact that I'm a nerd, and I was able to understand a lot of the references and concepts that they talked about in the show, while other people might not have. Like, randomly in a conversation, Sheldon will just start talking about the anthropic principle, and I'm like, I understand this is my show, man. Speaking of being relatable, there was one particular character in the show that was far and away my favorite, and I related to so much. And that was Sheldon Cooper. Much like Sheldon, I also struggle with obsessive-compulsive disorder and Asperger's syndrome, and had trouble interacting with people and large crowds, and I just in general shared many of his idiosyncrasies and personality traits, such as having a special spot that I like to sit in. There might be no other character in fictional history who I have ever felt a greater connection to than Sheldon Cooper. When I first started watching the series, I actually wanted to be just like Sheldon when I grew up, a badass, unyielding scientist slaying people with facts and logic left and right. Thankfully, by the time the series had ended, I had become much more open to change, just as Sheldon had by the end of the series, because let's be honest, he started out as a real asshole initially, though definitely an entertaining asshole with just how goofy he is. Like, as an example, there's one episode where Leonard asks Sheldon to keep a secret for him, and Sheldon obsesses so unnecessarily about how to craft the perfect airtight lie with no contradictions, to the point where things spiral so out of control that he has to hire an actor to play the part of a made-up character from the lie. It's hilarious. But on top of being just very entertaining, Sheldon has probably the most satisfying character arc in the show, as over time he has to come to understand the fact that he can't just treat his disorder as something that everyone else has to cater to and work around because he is special and better than everyone. He grows and matures and becomes more understanding of the feelings of the people around him and how they are impacted by his actions. And he comes to understand that even though he is compelled to have things a certain way that he likes, they are not necessarily the only way things are allowed to be. Again, I had to learn these lessons when I was growing up right along with Sheldon, and much like Sheldon, even though I've gotten a lot better, I still struggle greatly with them. So yeah, I really like Sheldon Cooper, and he might be the most relatable character in all of fiction for me. Jim Parsons, of course, did an amazing job bringing him to life, too. I'm not trying to claim that the character writing in the show is always super consistent or that is groundbreaking, but in addition to Sheldon, who I've already sung the show's praises for, I think a lot of the other characters like Leonard, Penny, Howard, and Amy are pretty likable and go through satisfying character developments too. Again, except for Raj, and maybe Bernadette too, and maybe Stuart. I mean, did he become a main character? He's in a lot of the episodes in later seasons, but he's never seen sitting in the living room with the other characters in the opening. I don't know. But I know what you're thinking. What's with all this positivity? This is the internet, a place of hate, negativity, and anger. I mean, I saw the title of this video, How the Big Bang Theory Could Have Been Better. Aren't you going to talk about how bad the show is and then explain how to fix it? Time for me to really lay into this series, right? Well, no, that's not what I'm going to be doing in this video. Sorry to disappoint you. I am a fan of this show, and it had a big impact on me as I was maturing, so I'm not just going to completely trash on it. I always start videos like this off with first talking about the things that I like and appreciate about a piece of media before getting into the criticisms. So let's get into those criticisms, shall we? As I implied before, The Big Bang Theory is hardly perfect, and while it's adequate, dare I say even good, it certainly has its problems throughout its run. It goes on for 12 seasons, and over such a long stretch of time, predictably the plot lines do get kind of repetitive, and the jokes start getting kind of stale. And there are certainly some not-so-great episodes of the series. But what I really want to talk about in this video are the missed opportunities I feel are present in it. Because when I look back on this show, I feel like there is wasted potential the story should have explored more. When you get down to it, The Big Bang Theory is kind of darker than you might remember. There's this joke that if you take away the laugh track, the show is actually a serious drama. And I mean, that has some truth to it. The Big Bang Theory is a comedy, and so it carries a more lighthearted tone throughout. But the characters in the show are dealing with some pretty serious issues. Sheldon, as I said before, has crippling obsessive-compulsive disorder, and he had an incredibly traumatizing childhood growing up in Texas around a lot of people who were physically abusive to him. Leonard had a horrific mother who essentially treated him as a science experiment all his life and never showed him the least bit of empathy. Howard was clearly not a very healthy individual, at least in the earlier seasons, and had borderline depressive and suicidal thoughts and actions that seemed to be trying to fill and seemed to be trying to fill the hole in his life with sex, constantly harassing women, and even one episode having his friends buy a prostitute for him. Raj is so nervous that he can't even speak to women without being intoxicated. Amy apparently has unusual body deformations, and she was so self-conscious about things like her webbed feet that she severed the webbing between her own toes as a child herself. These are very serious issues that the characters are dealing with, and I kind of think the show would have been better if it actually, took them more seriously. I think there's the potential for some really great and in-depth character analysis in Big Bang Theory about characters facing traumatic circumstances in their lives. A major theme I picked up on while watching the show is that all the characters, except for maybe Bernadette, are kind of broken in some way and are trying to search for something that will give them fulfillment. And it's because of that pattern that I kind of wish the show, as the show went on, it became more than just a comedy. As it stands, my biggest issue with The Big Bang Theory is that it just feels a bit too mainstream, like it isn't living up to its potential because it doesn't want to turn off a wider audience. And so things are played safer, things never get too serious, and while over the course of the show, characters do go through satisfying changes, except for Raj and maybe Bernadette and Stewart, many of the more pivotal moments and potentially interesting aspects of their character arcs are somewhat downplayed in order to keep things very sitcom-y and focus more on comedy. Important events happen off-screen, plot lines in episodes sometimes just never get resolved by the end or are never brought up again, and some multi-episode plot lines are just dropped entirely. Like, remember Stephanie Barnett, one of Leonard's love interests in Season 2? Well, the show didn't, because despite her continuing to be in a relationship with Leonard in her last appearance, she's never heard from again. But okay, I'll give an example of a plotline that isn't just dropped or resolved off screen, but was simply resolved disappointingly. At the end of Season 8, Amy breaks up with Sheldon as she simply gets fed up with putting up with so much of his nonsense for so long. And after this, Sheldon's character temporarily ends up regressing from the developments that he has been going through up to that point, and he goes out of his way to do spiteful things, clearly intending to hurt Amy, including being very misogynistic towards her. It's really unpleasant to watch, but it does make sense, as by that point Amy was really the only person Sheldon had formed a genuine romantic connection with in his life. While it's an interesting development, its resolution in the show is much less interesting. When Sheldon and Amy get back together in episode 10 of season 9, Sheldon basically just gives a very standard sitcom, I was wrong and I want you back and I love you speech that's undercut by a lot of comedy with Dave. Yeah, remember Dave? Who basically has to explain what Sheldon is even trying to say, and it ends with them kissing, to which of course the studio audience absolutely loses their minds over. That's not particularly satisfying as a moment, though, because it doesn't really give any indication that Sheldon has really made any effort to actually change or grow, which is especially problematic considering how terribly Sheldon was treating Amy beforehand. And so it's nothing more than a very bland and forgettable scene that doesn't really make any impact. Imagine the scene going like this instead. Sheldon realizes just how important Amy is in his life to him and goes over to her apartment. He still does his classic 3 knocks as always, but when Amy opens the door, the show surprises us with Sheldon acting completely seriously, in tears, saying, "I'm sorry, Amy. I'm sorry for all the times I treated you horribly, when I acted like your interests weren't as important as mine, when I acted like you had to do whatever I asked and cater to my every will, when I would act like being with you was a chore and there were millions of other things that I would rather be doing. I'm sorry for how I acted after our breakup, for how cruel and spiteful I was, all the obsessing over you and the sexist comments. I'm sorry for how terrible a boyfriend I was to you. I don't deserve you and everything that you've done for me. We don't have to be partners, and it would be ridiculous to ask you to marry me, but I just want you to know that I love you, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." This is a much more impactful scene that would demonstrate Sheldon's capacity to learn and grow, and it could have ended up being a really special and iconic scene of The Big Bang Theory, as for the first time Sheldon would be completely and earnestly calling out his past behavior as unequivocally wrong without any justifications. But that's not what happened, and although it is true that Sheldon does legitimately change and grow as a person and a partner after this moment in the show, there's just never really that hard-hitting and satisfying character moment for him, which is a problem throughout the show, as the writers seem to put prime focus and importance to jokes. And that's a problem because The Big Bang Theory goes on for 12 seasons, and I don't care how good a writer you are, after that long the jokes are just going to get stale, and you want to be able to balance them out with genuinely well-written and satisfying dramatic moments and plot lines that take real issues that people in real life have seriously. Another example of what I'm trying to talk about actually happens in the episode directly after the one I was just talking about, in which Sheldon has sex with Amy for the first time, which is a clear showcase of his new openness to change, and try to be more intimate with her. And while it is a nice moment, it feels too generic, and once again it plays the whole situation largely for comedy. And I want to make clear, I'm not saying that you can't have comedy in a genuine moment. I think that there are moments of The Big Bang Theory that are both funny and very genuine, that work very well, such as Leonard's final proposal to Penny. But in regards to Sheldon's character, we need to address the big elephant in the room. Sheldon is, clearly asexual, right? It's incredibly obvious that that is what the show is trying to portray him as, and he pretty much never expresses explicit attraction of a sexual nature, even after getting into a relationship with Amy. And yet it's never once in 12 seasons explicitly confirmed that he is, instead of Sheldon's asexuality being treated as a legitimate and valid part of his identity. Instead, there are a lot of jokes about how he's weird and stuff for not wanting to have sex like the rest of the guys. Sheldon Cooper is an iconic character representation for many people like me who have obsessive-compulsive disorder, and many asexual people have also seen him as a great example of asexual representation in media, or at least they might have if this aspect of his character was explored in any compelling ways. I don't have a problem with Sheldon being in a relationship with Amy. I think their relationship is actually pretty interesting and goes from a very toxic and unhealthy one initially to a more wholesome and healthy one over the course of the series. Some asexual people do have an interest in starting relationships. They are not all aromantic like I am, hence my channel name. And some are not even adverse to starting sexual relationships, despite not necessarily experiencing sexual attraction. But again, the problem is the fact that Sheldon is heavily coded to be asexual, but this is never referenced in any discussions Amy and Sheldon have about their relationship. Instead, it's just focused on Sheldon's quote-unquote intimacy issues, which get resolved in the episode I was talking about with little fanfare. It would have been really compelling to see Sheldon actually struggle to come to grips with this aspect of his identity, and how it's supposed to fit in with the fact that he is trying to be in a relationship with another person who does have sexual desires. BoJack Horseman is a show that actually does this very well, with one of the main characters, Todd, who is revealed to be asexual, going through an arc on the show, trying to grapple with his asexuality and how it fits into his desire for romantic companionship. The Big Bang Theory could have taken the chance to have its most popular character provide for explicit representation of a sexuality that hardly gets any in media, and give more ignorant viewers a chance to learn more about the struggles that some people go through that they themselves never have, but it doesn't because it generally plays things very safe and sanitized, and focuses on dramatic moments and plot lines that don't really stand out that much from other similar sitcoms. In fact, let's talk about Big Bang Theory's LGBTQ representation for a hot minute, because despite 3 out of 7 of the main cast members being heavily coded as queer, the Big Bang Theory's LGBTQ representation is not great. I can only remember 2 canon queer characters that have ever appeared over the show's 12-season run, both of whom only appeared in 1 episode and were used for the purpose of comedy. There are quite a bit of gay jokes in this show as well as trans jokes, and I mean, like I said before, I don't think that there are many things in the world that are above being the objects of mockery or ridicule, but for a show made in the 21st century, when that's pretty much all that queer characters are relegated to, it might come off as a bit problematic to some. I've already gone over why I think the asexual representation for Sheldon's character fails, but now let's go on to the other 2 queer-coded characters of the main cast, Amy and Rajesh. Amy Farrah Fowler is heavily coded as being bisexual, at least initially. It is implied that her affections towards Penny go way past the platonic and into the realm of sexual desire, and she even jokes at one point that she would rather have sex with Penny before she would ever have sex with Sheldon. But as with Sheldon, nothing about this aspect of her identity is ever explored or confirmed or focused on, and after a few seasons of her being introduced, the writers just kind of forgot about it, actually, as she never really seems to express any interest in women later on. You have a chance for legitimate bi-representation in the media that you set up, and then you don't go anywhere with it. That's what we call queerbaiting, and again, it's a missed opportunity to actually explore this as a part of Amy's character. This is especially considering the fact that Amy's mother is an extremely conservative Christian who did horrible things to her, like locking her in a sin closet as a child, and we can assume is super homophobic and has a very strict idea of an ideal one-man, one-woman relationship, as she was forcing Amy to go on a date with a guy at least once a year. But again, we can only ever assume this because the show never explicitly focuses on it, and where we could have gotten an in-depth look at how Amy tries to deal with her abusive and restrictive upbringing that vilified a core aspect of who she is, going into some really dark and serious territory that isn't often shown in sitcoms. Nope, we don't really get any of that. Amy is a good character, and overall she has a good character arc and character development, with her coming out of her shell and gaining more self-confidence in herself. But again, it's played very safe, and there aren't really those hard-hitting emotional moments that there could be with the setup of her character that has been given, with her mother mostly being used, again, for comedy whenever she appears in the show. And now we get to talk about the third and final queer-coded main cast member, Rajesh Koothrappali. Oh, Raj. What did they do to you, man? Rajesh Koothrappali is considered by many to be the worst character of the main cast in The Big Bang Theory, and it's not that difficult to see why. I actually thought he could be pretty funny and even somewhat endearing in the first few seasons, but the problem is that his character just went through the same story arc over and over again, with him getting a girlfriend, ruining it, getting another girlfriend, and ruining it again, and on the cycle goes for 12 damn seasons, while every other character of the main cast had pretty much already hooked up with their primary partners by the end of the 5th season. Rajesh does go through changes in his character, yes, like he gains the ability to speak to women without being drunk, but it doesn't really feel like meaningful character development, as his character kind of just ends up the same way he started relationship-wise, with no concrete markers showing a change in his attitude. Despite having just as much screen time as the other characters, his character gets no satisfying conclusive character arc or final send-off in the finale. The writers just had no idea what to do with him, and he basically just became the bland comic relief by the end with incredibly repetitive gags. Speaking of repetitive, oh your god, the gay jokes. So I mentioned before how Amy was pretty clearly coded as bisexual initially, but after a few seasons the writers just kind of forgot about that and dropped that aspect of her character. Not so for Raj, as the gay jokes pretty much continued throughout all 12 seasons, never letting up. Rajesh is heavily coded as bisexual or pansexual, with him very clearly being attracted to women, but also going on many times about how handsome he thinks certain men are, and having pretty clearly romantic coded relationship with Howard, with him even kissing him in one episode. But once again, this aspect of Rajesh's character is never explored. Him swinging both ways is only ever treated as a joke, which means that it's once again queerbaiting. And again, actually leaning into this aspect of Rajesh's character could have so easily led to more opportunities for storytelling that would have improved his character. In fact, get ready to
taste the rainbow, motherfucker!
Because I'm about to explain how to improve Raj's character and development immeasurably by just making him canonically queer. What if the show explored Raj's sexuality with him being in denial about the fact that he is interested in men and trying to constantly get with women to overcompensate, which would make sense considering he was raised in India, a country where the culture heavily frowns upon gay relationships. But over time, Raj's relationships with women keep failing miserably, and with all of his other friends having gotten with their significant others a while ago, he becomes disgruntled. And over time, he gets a lot closer with Stuart, after season 6, when they started hanging out after Howard went into space, who also has a long history of failures with tenable relationships with women. As the two become closer, it is clear that their relationship is more than just friends, and eventually, when the two are alone and get drunk, they engage in a hot, steamy love fest during the night for the first time, with Raj hopefully performing better than that weird fling but not really a fling he had with Penny that one time. Yeah, that's right. You know those gay jokes the show was making about Raj and Stuart being a thing? Well, you know what, in my rewrite, they wouldn't actually be jokes, and Stuart would end up being Raj's long-term partner in the show. Which means that there would finally be an excuse to give Stuart main character status. The guy deserves more love because he has crippling depression, and he deserves to sit around that damn coffee table with the other main characters in the opening theme. This would have been an infinitely better ending for Raj's character and Stuart's too than what we got with that whole new plotline in the final season, which was ultimately pointless since she just moves away to London, leaving Raj behind. But of course that was never going to happen because it was trying to appeal to a general audience, and heaven forbid you scare away the boomer audience by daring to say gay rights. That's why I say there's a lot of missed potential in The Big Bang Theory, and after watching the entire show all the way through, I think my biggest problem with it is that it never really took risks like that. It never tried to be subversive or daring or dramatic or deal with super serious issues when I think it could have been. And Raj's character, I think, suffers the most from this because he could have gone through really interesting arcs and developments, but didn't. Maybe after Raj has sex with Stuart for the first time, he is still in denial about him being bisexual, and even though he really likes Stuart, he feels he wouldn't be a real man if he tried to start so many relationships with women and all of them ended in failure. But then his friends try to encourage him, pointing out how he does have good relationships with women, his platonic ones, Penny, Bernadette, and Amy, and he's come a long way from the days when he couldn't even talk with women without being drunk, and that he shouldn't be afraid of starting a relationship he hasn't considered before just because the culture he was raised in frowned upon it. And the examples of how this show could have improved and kept itself interesting all the way through by taking certain plot points more seriously just go on and on. Rather than Raj somehow just accidentally getting over his selective mutism accidentally in the Season 6 finale, the show could have shown the incredibly difficult steps it would have taken for someone to overcome a disorder like that. He would be going to therapy and really trying to analyze the core of his issues, and he would also be trying to get over his alcohol dependency that he developed, which caused major problems for him in his life. Sort of similar to the character of BoJack Horseman from, BoJack Horseman. You remember that really hot redhead Raj was dating for a while named Emily, who for some reason was really attracted to him and got incredibly distraught after they broke up? This plotline was really wasted in my opinion, especially since Emily was not nearly as interesting or realistic as a love interest as Lucy, Raj's previous girlfriend, who was dealing with crippling anxiety. And yet Emily appeared in more episodes. Well, let's think about how we can make that plotline more interesting. In the series, Emily is clearly portrayed as having a lot of, shall we say, kinky fetishes, not all of which Raj is entirely comfortable with, like how in the finale of Season 8 she wanted Raj to have sex with her in a graveyard. Now, the direction I thought the show was going in was that Raj was going to become more and more uncomfortable with her sexual demands and ultimately break things off with her for that reason. But that isn't what happens at all, and instead Raj decides to break up with her because he has a romantic interest in someone named Claire, who ends up rejecting his advances anyway. What if instead this plotline was taken more seriously and it is made clear to the audience over time that, as Raj joked about, there is something wrong with Emily and she only continues to be with Raj to take advantage of his loneliness and desperation to live out her darkest fantasies, and her treatment of Raj in the bedroom keeps getting more sadistic and extreme. His friends would be trying to warn him that if he isn't comfortable, then he needs to break it off with Emily, and that if she is forcing him to have sex with her when he doesn't want to, then he is the victim of sexual assault. This would, of course, open up a lot of interesting opportunities for character development with Raj, as he would have to try to find a way out of a very toxic and manipulative relationship that didn't start out that way at first, and he would have to make peace with the fact that being together with someone is not always better for you than being single. And, of course, his manhood would be further questioned by the fact that he would be the victim of sexual assault. Speaking of unhealthy and toxic relationships, by the way, why don't we talk about Howard and Bernadette? I think outside of Rajesh, Bernadette is probably the second worst character of the main cast, though she's not quite as bad as Raj, since while she can be really overly mean-spirited at times, there are definitely times where she's definitely in the right. But let's be honest, her relationship with Howard is not a great one. While the two do have their cute moments, and Bernadette is pretty important in terms of Howard's development, their relationship is not very healthy. I mean, Bernadette can just be very overly vindictive to the point of being verbally abusive to Howard, and Howard is often showcased to not contribute as much to their relationship as Bernadette, and leaves her with a lot of responsibilities. And while these problems in their relationship are addressed throughout the series, they don't really have any effective resolutions. I think the most egregious example is when, in Season 4, there's an episode where Howard tries living with Bernadette at her apartment for the first time, and she kicks him out because he starts treating her like his mother. This is never addressed again, and later in the same season, the two get engaged. I really like Leonard and Penny's relationship in the series, and I think it's probably the most healthy and genuine, and also probably realistic. And although Sheldon and Amy's relationship didn't start off that great, with Sheldon constantly demanding things of Amy and giving very little in return, over the course of the series, I began to like the two more and more as a pairing, as Sheldon grew as a character to become a much better person, and Amy grew as a character, becoming more assertive, and it's obvious why the two ended up together in the end with their shared passion for scientific development. However, Howard and Bernadette as a couple is just something that I could never really get behind in the show. Their relationship was mismatched from the very beginning, and they got engaged and married way too fast, while the other two couples took a long time to work out their issues before getting hitched. And Howard and Bernadette just constantly get into bitter arguments throughout the series and just learn to live that way, I guess, which is unfortunately a very common trope in sitcoms with a bickering married couple where they'll just be portrayed for comedy purposes. So what if the show actually addressed this, and sometime after Bernadette gives birth for the first time, Howard and Bernadette's relationship is pushed to the breaking point, and they actually end up getting divorced? This would, of course, work to make the show more interesting, as it would serve to shake up the status quo, where both Howard and Bernadette would have to deal with the fallout from breaking off a relationship they were in with someone for a long time that they even had a kid with. This would actually tie in nicely with the plotline of Raj's parents getting divorced. This was teased a bit in the original series, but what if hearing from Raj about how his parents' relationship depreciated over time to the point where all they did was snap at each other, and they became happier after their marriage ended, actually caused Howard and Bernadette to become introspective and question whether their relationship is worth holding on to, ultimately due to some kind of incident deciding that it's not, and it is simply better to break things off before they keep getting worse. After this, they would of course have to go through a lot of struggles, figuring out if they want to move on to another serious romantic relationship, trying to figure out how to raise their child while no longer being married, reconsidering why they even decided to get married in the first place. However, they would both ultimately come to the conclusion that even though divorcing was a good idea, they were both ultimately the better for being in that relationship in the first place, as Howard became more responsible and toned down his pickup artist persona severely, and Bernadette, at least in my rewrite, would have learned to maybe not be so overly critical of people and vindictive towards them. And of course, both of them would now have a child that they love and would dedicate their lives to raising. I think that this would actually be a pretty good lesson for viewers of the show to learn, that the person you fall in love with and marry isn't necessarily going to be right for you, and it is okay to break things off if there are serious, unavoidable issues. However, just because that person was never meant to be in your life forever doesn't mean that you didn't have a lot of good memories with them, or that your relationship didn't have a positive impact on your development as a person. BoJack Horseman is actually a pretty good example of how to do this plotline well with Diane and Mr. Peanut Butter's relationship. There are actually a lot of missed opportunities regarding Howard's character in the series, despite the fact that I actually do like his character, to be honest. Like, remember that episode where Howard met his half-brother that he never knew, and at the end of it they said that they would stay in touch, and then he never appears again? Why would the show not take advantage of that to give Howard more development? Or, that episode where Howard was robbed of an opportunity because of his shady history and stuff like accidentally crashing the Mars rover? What if that wasn't just a one-off episode? I mean, let's be real here. At the beginning of the series, Howard does some really sketchy shit, much of it illegal, and he also constantly harasses women sexually. He of course changes throughout the series into a better person, but wouldn't it have been more interesting to see him suffer long-term consequences for some of his actions? Like, one day his actions and behavior catches up to him despite trying to put everything behind him, and he loses his job and the respect of his coworkers, and is even threatened with jail time. Like what happened to BoJack Horseman in BoJack Horseman. You could have Howard really struggling to try to pull his life together with the current circumstances compounding on top of his divorce, and the fact that he has to raise his kid now, which would go towards truly teaching him the meaning of responsibility and bringing his character arc full circle. And like I said before, out of the members of the main cast, Bernadette is probably the second least likable outside of Raj. She's really just overly mean a lot of the time and does things like trying to sabotage Howard's chances of going to space despite later taking credit for him becoming an astronaut, and getting mad at Penny for getting a promotion while also taking credit for her getting the job she did. It would have been really great if the show had explored her character more and legitimately dealt with her major issues regarding her competitiveness and spitefulness, and gave a better explanation as to why she was so gravitated towards Howard, a very irresponsible and immature person, in the first place. Maybe it could have something to do with the little detail that is never brought up again, that Bernadette was apparently put in charge of running an illegal daycare, and so she's been conditioned to have a very responsible and caring nature, which meant she was sort of subconsciously gravitated to this man-child Howard, like Howard was subconsciously gravitated towards her dommy-mommy vibes. Maybe even though she gets really annoyed with Howard, she actually likes cleaning up his messes and being in charge. Sort of like Princess Carolyn in BoJack Horseman. In fact, unlike Bernadette, Princess Carolyn from BoJack Horseman is actually a really good example of how to do an overly competitive, work-obsessed girl boss mother who clings to an irresponsible womanizer really well. And honestly, as I'm writing this, I just realized that almost all of my criticisms of The Big Bang Theory boil down to BoJack Horseman did it better. But yeah, for real, BoJack Horseman is just such a good example of how to make a fantastic sitcom that's both hilarious but also has fantastically written characters that deal with really serious and mature issues, that has incredible moments of character progression and regression with consequences for every action that aren't just dropped or downplayed for comedy. More sitcoms should really learn to take after it, animated or not. Anyway, I guess we still got 2 more characters to get through, but I'm going to wrap this video up pretty soon. Penny, last name not mentioned in the entire series somehow, is probably the least screwed up of any of the main characters. I mean, she may not have had the best home life, and some of her siblings and cousins definitely went down some pretty bad paths, but she at least had parents who seemed pretty supportive of her and wasn't constantly bullied at school. However, that is not to say that Penny is not an interesting character. She's far more than just the girl in the group. She's assertive, but also kind. She screws up a lot and definitely isn't as smart as the other characters, but she is open to learning and expanding her interests, and she has to struggle with the fact that she has wide ambitions that she wants to work hard for, but that ultimately don't end up coming to fruition. I really liked her development in the series and her growing relationship with Leonard, and don't at me, I would probably say that she's the best girl. Thank goodness they didn't go with the original Penny in the pilot, woof. So I don't take that much issue with the fact that she might not be dealing with issues as serious and traumatic as the other characters, since she is sort of the glue that holds the whole friend group together in the series, and her unrealized dreams and ambitions of becoming an actress are honestly interesting enough. But I guess I do wish that the show focused more in the later seasons on the fact that Penny hates her job in the pharmaceutical industry and wants to quit. There was never really much of a resolution to that dilemma, and being disenfranchised with your job is a very relatable issue that a lot of people deal with, so I would have liked to see it be given more focus. Finally, we have Leonard, who I guess was originally supposed to be the main star, but, before the show leaned more towards Sheldon being the focus. While Leonard does play as more of the straight man of the group, there is no denying that he had an incredibly traumatizing childhood, due to his sociopathic mother treating his life as a science experiment and never showing him any real affection. It's heartbreaking seeing how much she still has her claws in him as an adult, and I do wish his relationship with his mother was treated as dark as it is in the series, and got more focus. There is also the problem that Leonard reconciling with his mother feels too generic and safe. It's like Leonard's mother eventually does come around and try to support her son unconditionally, but it just didn't feel earned, and recognizing her own faults did not seem to be in character for her. What if instead Leonard's mother never actually changed in the series, and Leonard has to deal with the fact that after so many years of trying desperately, he simply never got approval or love from his mother, the person he wanted it from most of all, which is something that sometimes happens to real people. In fact, what if later in the series Leonard's mom had her sharp wit and analytical abilities stripped away from her, and she got early onset of dementia, which meant that when Leonard finally got the courage to tell her off, it wouldn't even be satisfying because she wouldn't even be her anymore, and god damn it, I'm ripping off BoJack Horseman again, aren't I? I can't help it, the series is just so good. Well, anyway, the main point I'm trying to get in this video is this. The Big Bang Theory really isn't a bad show. Sure, there's probably a lot better live-action sitcoms out there that I haven't watched, but there are almost certainly a lot worse as well, and I, for one, happen to care about the show. I care about its characters and the development that they went through. And even though it wasn't that common in the series, every so often there would be an episode like the Closet Reconfiguration in Season 6, which has what is probably my favorite moment in the entire series, where the cast figure out an incredibly creative way to tell Howard what was in his dad's letter without actually telling him. It's a genuinely emotional and powerful moment that made me tear up while I watched it, and there are brief glimpses like that in the series of the heights that Big Bang Theory could have reached if it had realized its potential. Because this show did have a lot of potential to be more than just a sitcom, and there are moments where The Big Bang Theory can be really genuine, such as when Sheldon has to deal with the death of his childhood hero, Professor Proton, or Howard has to deal with the death of his mother. It's because I care about the show and I care about the characters that I can see how this show could have been so much better if after the first few seasons it focused less on comedy and gave more focus to its dramatic side. I get the feeling that Big Bang Theory would have left a much more lasting impact and even been groundbreaking if it took itself more seriously, if it had legitimate LGBTQ representation, if it had more consequences to the characters' actions, and if dramatic plot lines were given much more focus and longer time to resolve, and the very serious issues the characters were dealing with were treated with much more weight. But like I said before, the show is just, it feels very light, and is trying to widely appeal to a lot of people, and that does end up bringing it down. Along with a lot of really sloppy and unnecessary filler plotlines that go nowhere and don't really amount to anything in the end, usually having to do with one of the guys trying to get a girlfriend that they are obviously not going to end up with in the end. To be honest, I have a very similar problem with the Young Sheldon spin-off series. I honestly thought the concept had a lot of potential, seeing an incredibly particular and intelligent asexual atheist child trying to navigate the environment of Blood Red Texas. That could provide for a lot of possibilities for dramatic storytelling, dealing with the sometimes deadly consequences of nonconformism in a conformist society, showcasing the more ugly side of conservative Christian America. I thought that this spin-off series could really end up being a worthy successor to The Big Bang Theory and give its characters complex and nuanced development, with many of them being far from likable but still complex and interesting. But instead, young Sheldon mostly focuses on the comedic aspect of situations and hardly ever takes itself too seriously. And I didn't really like how it often downplayed the more ugly aspects of Sheldon's childhood, like how the show changed characters like Sheldon's dad, who people on The Big Bang Theory talked about like he was a really abusive, adulterous asshole, into more of a goofy dad character. Would it not be more interesting to actually show the pitfalls of an abusive, codependent relationship on screen? Oh well, at least they ditched the laugh track. But much like its predecessor, Young Sheldon is just very light, and it doesn't live up to anywhere near its potential. And it's because of that despite sticking with The Big Bang Theory right up until its ending, which was honestly pretty good, I ended up dropping Young Sheldon in the middle of its third season because there was just nothing that was really that interesting about it, and it wasn't even that funny. And also, I know he's just a kid, but I'm sorry, Ian Armitage is just never going to be as charismatic as Jim Parsons was. That guy just is Sheldon Cooper. But like I said before, I don't hate The Big Bang Theory. I like the show, even if there are aspects of the show that might not be so great. And to be honest, despite nearly everyone on the internet constantly complaining about how the show is, I've never actually seen any videos on YouTube from people actually doing rewrites and explaining how the show could have been improved. So I hope you all enjoyed this constructive criticism from a fan of the show. Anyway, this has been the Aromantic Shipper. Please make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, check out my channel. I do other rewrite videos and media analysis. And always remember, just because you can't feel love doesn't mean you shouldn't want other people to. Bye.